It felt like my future family, the family that I wanted, the family that I dreamed of, was slipping through my fingers, and I was powerless to stop it. And if that wasn't enough, there was constant comparison with those around me. Seeing others get pregnant was a unique kind of heartbreak. You see, every pregnancy announcement felt like I was losing my dream. And I'd scroll and see those baby bump photos or those gender reveals, and I'd want to be happy for them so much, but I couldn't help but feel like I was falling behind. It wasn't jealousy, it was just grief for my own unmet dreams.